This is a once-in-a-100-year type event.
Australia's in recession.
And the pandemic's pain was felt far and wide.
The coronavirus pandemic devastated Australia's economy.
The Ruby Princess afflicted with the coronavirus.
But one local company has made a killing.
The New South Wales police boat dropped off members of Aspen Medical.
Aspen Medical has been hand-picked for lucrative health contracts worth more than $1 billion.
Commonwealth provider is Aspen Medical.
Aspen Medical have achieved remarkable success with the clinic.
Since long before COVID-19, the company has enjoyed a close relationship with those in power.
It's paid access. You have dinner with the minister or lunch with the minister, and it costs you money. They don't do it because they like the look of your face.
But despite its promises, Aspen Medical has repeatedly failed to deliver.
They were unable to provide a sufficient in number and experienced workforce to safely care for these vulnerable residents, and people suffered. People suffered.
It was unprofessional to go ahead with the contract under those circumstances, as we weren't able to deliver those things that were promised inside the contract.
And sometimes the consequences are grave.
Aspen Medical, where's their sense of ethics? They pride themselves on, if we can't deliver something, we will tell the customer, i.e. in this case the Commonwealth Government. Why didn't they have the guts to do that?
The company has a long record of turning misery into big business.
It worries me when for-profits have discovered humanitarian disasters as being opportunities like a gold strike to say we can make dollars out of that.
This is a business. This is a big business. The medical side of it doesn't seem to be a concern. So just making money. That's all they're in for.
Would you say the company was ruthless about profit?
Certainly.
Tonight on Four Corners, we investigate Aspen Medical and ask how this company, with its top-level political connections, so profited from the pandemic. We also reveal how it's been embroiled in an international criminal investigation into corruption and money laundering.
Plans and the capabilities are in place here in Australia to deal with issues of this nature.
We have a national medical stockpile which is available and from which masks are being deployed.
As the COVID-19 pandemic took hold in early 2020, the federal government was suddenly plunged into a fierce international contest to secure supplies of vital personal protective equipment.
The supply chain, which we relied on, it collapsed. People were fearful, worried, they didn't know what was happening, so we needed an enormous amount of PPE urgently. Everybody was in the same boat. Every advanced country was chasing every potential PPE and prepared to pay a lot of money for it.
To move fast, the government outsourced the procurement, selecting companies without any public tender.
The point of probity rules is to get the best value for money. And some people might call it red tape, but there's a trade-off between efficiency and urgency.
The big winner was Aspen Medical,
Right on time.
a Canberra-based health services provider that specialises in recruiting medical staff.
Quietly over the last week, the government has secured an additional 54 million masks to support our health and medical service workers.
It was awarded contracts worth more than $1.1 billion to supply PPE on a national scale, something it had never done before. Aspen Medical's contracts were worth $500 million more than any other providers.
Tell me about the experience that Aspen had up until that point in procuring face masks.
Again, I can only talk up until 2019, but it would be zero.
What do you mean zero?
Oh, we'd never done that before.
It had never procured face masks?
Never.
No one was more surprised when Aspen Medical won these contracts than Andrew Walker, who co-founded Aspen Medical 20 years ago. He quit the company in 2019 and set up a rival firm after a bitter boardroom dispute over Aspen Medical's poor financial performance.
The financial situation was parlous. We were breaching banking covenants. We'd had multiple years of multi-million-dollar losses, coupled with multiple years of multi-revenue declines and a shrinking balance sheet.
It's been a remarkable turnaround. A few years ago, Aspen Medical was in the red, but in just 2 years, it secured $1.6 billion in revenue. The bulk of this money is from pandemic contracts awarded without public tender. And its pre-tax profit, $420 million, or 25%.
I think anything up to and just slightly above 10% is fine. I think 25% is actually getting on the higher side.
Gouging?
Oh, one could interpret it as that, yes.
Call the Minister for Health.
From the outset, Aspen Medical has cultivated close relationships with the government.
We've contracted with the great Australian company Aspen.
Great Canberra success stories like Aspen Medical, for instance.
When he was Health Minister, Tony Abbott opened the company's offices in Canberra, and in 2014, his government awarded it a lucrative contract for a clinic overseas.
Aspen is a very, very well regarded Australian provider.
The company's record and charm offensive have impressed a roll call of other politicians.
But one thing I know, when we need a partner in times such as this, Aspen Medical is a reliable and trusted partner.
Aspen Medical's access to the Liberal government is in part thanks to this man, Michael Wooldridge, who was Health Minister in the Howard government. In 2007, the company recruited Wooldridge to its board.
Michael had his own consulting firm, his own political consulting firm, and we engaged that consulting firm separate to Michael's position on the board. But yes, Michael's a very astute political operator, and he was able to help Aspen in how to traverse some of the political pitfalls you can get as a contractor.
In 2014, Michael Wooldridge was banned from acting as a company director by the corporate regulator after the collapse of a retirement village investment scheme.
Mr. Wooldridge was one of 5 former directors fined by the federal court.
However, he continued to attend Aspen Medical's board meetings as an advisor.
To my very good friend Michael Wooldridge.
Wooldridge has maintained close contacts in the Liberal Party. Greg Hunt has spoken fondly of enjoying his company.
During the course of the evening, Mike served one of his vintage ports. He's very proud of his vintage port.
Hunt and Wooldridge go back many years.
Obviously, Greg Hunt is a politician, Michael's a politician. I'm sure that they are well known to each other. I believe they're quite close friends. I know Michael Wooldridge has introduced me to Greg Hunt, and he and Michael has arranged for me to go to Greg Hunt's office, which is very nice, on a budget dinner. I think Michael's family has a connection with Greg Hunt's family. I think Michael's sister Mary may have been at university with Minister Hunt.
In a statement, a spokesman for Greg Hunt said he recalled meeting Wooldridge and Aspen Medical during a budget night when he would have met hundreds of people. Andrew Walker says the company's access to power was obtained through Michael Wooldridge's connections and regular donations to the Liberal Party.
Well, that's absolute rubbish.
He did give access. It's paid access. You have a dinner with the minister or lunch with the minister, and it costs you money. They don't do it because they like the look of your face. But there's very much this paid access, and Michael and his consulting firm were able to facilitate that.
Greg Hunt's office told Four Corners that
we are not aware of nor have any record of any lobbying by Dr. Wooldridge on behalf of Aspen Medical in relation to any procurement, nor was the firm introduced to either the department or the Minister by Dr. Wooldridge. The Minister was not involved in any purchasing recommendations, assessments, approvals, contract negotiations or decisions.
The statement pointed to a finding by the Audit Office that PPE purchases were within or below the appropriate price range, and added,
Minister Hunt has had minimal engagement with Aspen.
However, Four Corners has obtained a letter of commendation for Aspen Medical, written and signed by Greg Hunt in the midst of the PPE negotiations. It described the company as world recognised and nationally awarded, and said it was a trusted supplier of health services to the Australian government. The letter was undated and addressed to whom it may concern.
Here we have a minister in charge, or who's a minister assisting in the area of the public service, writing a letter which is highly dubious, undated, fulsome, to whom it may concern. We've got no idea, neither does he, in what context Aspen Medical would use this letter. So it is extraordinarily unusual and, in fact, dangerous for a minister, or in fact for a public servant, to actually have any contact, any engagement, and certainly to write a letter of this kind.
Greg Hunt's spokesman says the letter
was written to support Aspen Medical in tendering for work in the United States and is appropriate for Australian firms assisting in international activity.
Aspen Medical is a donor to the ALP too. In 2020, the Queensland Labor government invested in the company's new face mask manufacturing plant. Earlier this year, Aspen was also granted a multi-million-dollar contract without tender for a Queensland quarantine facility.
Premier, you have the call. I'm advised by the Deputy Premier that they were the only company that could do that contract.
In April 2020, Aspen Medical seized another golden opportunity, a deal now worth $45 million, which also didn't go to a public tender. This time, it was to provide a surge workforce to aged care homes ravaged by coronavirus. Yet again, it was a job Aspen Medical had never done before, and no one knew how they would find the staff.
They were unable to provide a sufficient in number and experience workforce to safely care for these vulnerable residents. And they wouldn't have been able to, even if the residents were stable, and this was a time where a significant percentage of the residents in these facilities were not stable because they were suffering from COVID-19 infection and its many attendant problems.
In July, Aspen Medical was among a number of government contractors called into St Basil's Home for the Aged in Melbourne to replace scores of workers. But by 6:35 p.m, the night before those Aspen staff were due to arrive, the company had found only 7 people to attend. It emailed the government admitting, "I appreciate it's not a pretty picture." 2 minutes later, the government replied, "Not just ugly, completely inadequate. We need people there for 7 a.m.
It's almost like they led the Commonwealth government on, and of course when push came to shove and people's lives were on the stake, my mother, her life was on the line.
Christine Golding's mother, Aphraxia, was one of 117 residents living there in July 2020 when the surge workforce took over.
They failed. And you know, I'm not talking about providing a commodity, a product. I'm talking about people's lives, their inability to pull the pin and say, we're not getting involved in this. People are going to die potentially. People will definitely suffer.
I was completely shocked and horrified. I was, because I'd been in multiple meetings where We had discussed our concerns that there would not be sufficient staff to be able to provide care.
Dr. Sandra Brown, a geriatrician from the local hospital, witnessed what happened next and filed a scathing report to the Victorian Health Department. It said, "Yesterday we felt we were enabling neglect." She reported residents not being fed, personal care had not been attended for incontinent patients, delays to medication delivery, many breaches in the PPE observed by the PSA staff, multiple falls. All the residents were placed at risk.
For me, that was the most distressing day of my career to date.
50 residents of St Basil's died, including Christine Golding's mother. The coroner is yet to determine how many died of COVID-19 and how many died of neglect. No one party is solely responsible for the tragedy.
There's many points of failures. There's not one thing that caused 50 people to die in that 4-week period. So there were many parties, and that's why it's complex. Of course Aspen's responsible. They were one. At any time, at any point in time, they could have said, it's not going to work.
Aspen told Four Corners it provided staff in exceptionally difficult circumstances, was only paid for the staff it did provide, and that an independent review made no adverse findings against the company in relation to its role at St Basil's.
They knew it was risky, but yet they went ahead with it. They went along with it. You know why? It wasn't their mum in there, wasn't their dad in there, wasn't their grandmother in there, wasn't their grandfather in there.
This was not the first time Aspen's work under a federal contract was called into question. Patrick Castles now works for Andrew Walker, but in 2014 he was recruited by Aspen Medical to rescue a $170 million a year contract to provide healthcare on Australia's defence bases.
It was a very rocky marriage from day one, and it never improved. And it became quite personal and bitter between some of the parties.
Defence were not happy with Aspen?
Not at all.
The Defence Department repeatedly complained about Aspen Medical's performance, citing medication errors as well as the quality and number of staff it provided.
They were claiming all sorts of breaches of the contract requirements, whether they be in credentialing, whether they be in key performance indicators, or failure to do certain things or undertake certain things and complete them satisfactorily.
Aspen Medical was issued with formal notices for failing to achieve the targets it had agreed to.
Aspen certainly signed up for those. They were the basis of the contract, and that's what was contained within the contract. So for each of those breaches represented almost $5,000, and they added up very quickly across a number of years. And the amount in dispute at one stage is well over $1 million.
Aspen Medical acknowledged it paid compensation for staffing shortfalls under the contract, adding this was inevitable given the scale of the job.
That contract was not renewed, and at the time it was made apparent that the customer was not happy with the way we were going about our business. I think that's fair to say.
Following Andrew Walker's departure from the company, he and Aspen's executive chairman, Glenn Keys, are now suing each other over their separation agreement.
Is your motivation in the litigation you're pursuing, and indeed in talking with me, is it motivated by the darkness of that moment?
Oh, absolutely not. No. You know, that was 2018. It's a long time ago, and we all move on. You know, it's you move on to bigger and better things. You know, and in fact, in many ways, I'm very fortunate that it happened because it has actually allowed me to find a better path.
Following the end of the defence contract, Aspen Medical was looking for new opportunities.
In 2016, it was awarded a contract to provide healthcare at a newly privatised women's prison in Perth called Melaleuca. The prison quickly developed a shocking reputation.
It's way below standards. And I can't emphasise this enough. We already have an incredibly substandard, negligent provision of mental health to people in prison. And this is falling so below that already very, very low standard. And it was inevitably going to put lives at risk.
Lawyer Sally Oliver used to regularly visit Melaleuca to see prisoners with acute mental health needs.
I do remember there was a very rare occasion where I did actually manage to place a phone call through to one of the mental health nurses, and she told me she was the only one on staff. She was absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of work she needed to do. So that was alarming. But then soon after that, a colleague told me that, in fact, there was no treating psychiatrist at Melaleuca. And I felt an immediate panic because that left those women in danger.
Former Aspen Medical executive Patrick Castles says the company knew it was not meeting its undertakings.
For example, psychiatry was part of that deal, and we were unable to provide it to the extent as required inside the contract because the funding wasn't there for it. So indeed, it did have some poor outcomes for the customers.
In 2017, a 31-year-old woman stopped breathing inside her cell at Melaleuca prison and later died. Sent to jail over unpaid fines, Callie Graham had arrived at the prison unwell. She was coming off heroin and had been prescribed anti-seizure medication. Her cellmate, Katie Ann Wallace, remembers how sick she was.
I said to her, you know, Chickie, you don't look too well. And she told me no, she's not, that she had come from hospital. And she said that the hospital had told the police and had told the prison that if her condition got worse, that she was to return to hospital.
After requesting, but never receiving her anti-seizure medication, Callie Graham began convulsing and went into cardiac arrest. Her cellmate pressed the call button for help, triggering a code red. An inquest heard last month that the Aspen Medical nurse on duty missed the alarm.
It appeared to me that she was watching something on her computer screen. It looked like a movie or a TV program.
And she didn't have her earpiece?
That's right.
The nurse denied this evidence. By the time the nurse arrived with a resuscitation kit, Callie's cellmate, Katie Ann Wallace, herself a former emergency nurse, was already performing CPR.
I opened up the resus kit. There was no oxygen in the tank. This is meant to be a brand new bag. Every time you use a resus kit, you replenish everything in it. She might as well have not brought the bag.
The same failure by Aspen Medical to properly check its emergency kits had been reported by the Department of Defence 3 years earlier. There was an 8-minute delay while the nurse ran back for another oxygen tank. Doctors would later tell the court this delay may not have been the cause of Callie's death, although one added, it is not excusable to have an empty oxygen cell.
Obviously, they weren't doing their checks. They weren't following through with the protocol that they were supposed to. When you work in a hospital or anything, you're instructed to do the same things, which is you have check your lines, you check your supplies, and those checks are done for a reason, so things like this don't happen.
At the inquest, the nurse castigated Aspen Medical for failing to ensure the emergency bags were properly checked and restocked, saying there was no system, nothing in place, no leadership.
These simple things are some of the reasons my sister is dead today. So, you know, it's not right. It's not okay.
Callie Graham's sister, Caris, says she never should have been forced to say goodbye this way.
I'm not meant to do that, am I? You know, your sisters don't die at 31. They're meant to be there for the rest of your life. They're meant to grow old together, have kids together, raise cousins together, you know? We're supposed to look after our parents together, you know? And it's not going to happen, is it?
Aspen Medical declined to comment about its work in Melaleuca because of the ongoing inquest.
Just days after Callie Graham died, Aspen Medical produced an internal report which reveals the company knew from the very start it was never going to be able to provide adequate healthcare to the women in this prison. It would have needed almost double the money to do so. The draft document explicitly admitted Aspen Medical's reduced staffing posed a highly significant clinical risk, creating the potential for a near-miss catastrophe or death in custody due to lack of doctor cover. What does that say to you?
Oh, it's difficult to hear. It's difficult for them to treat these women like they're not humans. I really enjoyed the women I work with, and I really cared about my role. And it's very difficult to hear something so callous.
A significant part of Aspen Medical's business is providing healthcare in the world's hotspots. It ran a field hospital in war-torn Iraq, and in Timor-Leste, its physicians saved the life of President Jose Ramos Horta. The company's work has won plaudits, but also raised concerns about the ethics of so-called disaster capitalism.
So if they have Ebola, they go through to our confirmed area.
This tension surfaced in 2014 when Ebola struck Sierra Leone.
The Ebola outbreak was just terrifying, not just in West Africa, but for the whole world. It was spreading so fast, there was just panic. Such was the fear of the spreading that the Australian government were prompted to respond.
Under pressure, Tony Abbott's government selected Aspen Medical to provide Australia's contribution to the crisis.
My anticipation is that Aspen will have some staff on the ground in Sierra Leone within days.
The Abbott government overlooked the existing taxpayer-funded team of emergency physicians called AUSMAT, instead paying Aspen Medical $15 million to do the job.
AUSMAT is the premier medical humanitarian response body that Australia has. Trained, resourced, ready to go with a great track record. All of us assumed that AUSMAT would be deployed. And when AUSMAT missed out to Aspen, which none of us had heard of at that time, we were scratching our heads. It was very puzzling to any of us working in this sector. There was no tender. Aspen just got it. That's what was so surprising.
Former Greens leader, public health advisor Dr. Richard Di Natale inspected Aspen's facilities in Sierra Leone and was impressed.
I attended the Aspen site. The protocols looked to be entirely appropriate. The infrastructure looked to be appropriate. What was surprising though was that Aspen didn't have a long history of experience in serious outbreak investigations.
Though never revealed publicly, Aspen Medical made a substantial profit on the job. It originally expected to make a margin of about 13%. The company made twice that profit, more than $3.7 million.
Well, we've got to ask ourselves, when it comes to an outbreak or a natural disaster, Do we want the people there so they can make a buck, or do we want them there so that they can help the community? We should ensure that if we're delivering an emergency response, our primary focus is on helping people, and a profit motive shouldn't exist.
In a statement, Aspen Medical said it is reasonable to expect commercial entities to make a profit on contracts.
I think for-profits have realised that a disaster, it's a bit like a gold strike. You go, plant your flag, say we're here. I saw Aspen on its website said we helped stop Ebola. Well, this is hype from for-profits. It's hype.
There's one overseas contract Aspen Medical does not boast about. It was a contract to help build a multi-million-dollar hospital in Sri Lanka in 2012. Now it's been caught up in a high-level corruption and money laundering investigation. We've travelled all the way here to Hambantota on Sri Lanka's southern coast to investigate this 900-bed hospital and to determine what role Aspen Medical really played in its construction. Aspen Medical was subcontracted by a Dutch company called EN Projects. It was backed by an Australian government guarantee on the basis it would supply equipment and medical design for the hospital. Andrew Walker says he remembers nothing of the sort.
It was presented to me that we were facilitating a loan, and by that I assume that to mean we were introducing someone to a financier and that we would be paid some kind of introduction fee or other.
What did Aspen actually do in Sri Lanka then?
I don't know.
Do you have any recollection of Aspen ever deploying staff in Sri Lanka?
No, definitely not. I can say with absolute clarity that we've never deployed staff in Sri Lanka.
For Andrew Walker, the alarm bells rang when he tried to open a new bank account and was refused.
Then very shortly afterwards, my own bank sent me an email, and they were basically saying I had some questions that I had to answer because of my association with Aspen Medical, to which I was very much taken aback. I spoke to the bank, but most of it was by email, but I spoke to the bank, and it was suggested to me that Aspen had been mentioned in a corruption case in Sri Lanka.
Four Corners has obtained this internal Aspen Medical spreadsheet, which indicates the company's role was purely as a financial intermediary. It shows Aspen receiving funds, then paying those same funds back out to contractors in return for a 4% handling fee.
None of this was presented at any board meeting. I was pretty much unawares of it all until I finally got a spreadsheet with some numbers in, and looked at the numbers and looked at the margins, a reasonable margin.
This all happened while you were a director and a 50% shareholder. How can you say, sitting there today, that you really did not know what was going on?
Easily, because I didn't know what was going on. I'm very comfortable that I was completely unaware of this.
The spreadsheet reveals the first and largest of Aspen Medical's payments were made to a mysterious company called Sabre Vision Holdings, domiciled in the notorious tax haven of the British Virgin Islands. The payments totalled 1.4 million euros, now about 2 million Australian dollars. The company was owned by a high-flying Sri Lankan businessman, Nimal Pereira, who has since been implicated in a series of corruption scandals, including a global bribery scheme. Is there any legitimate reason that an Australian medical company, as its first act in Sri Lanka, pays $2 million to Nimal Pereira for a hospital project? Is there any way that...
Because Nimal Pereira has nothing to do with hospital projects. You know, he's nothing. Even during, I also know him personally. He has never spoken to me for any projects in the health sector. He has nothing to do with the health sector projects. because he's for, you know, other financial things and other industries, but nothing to do with health.
So why would Aspen Medical pay his offshore company $2 million?
That is for somebody else.
I'm shocked that an Australian company who gets a contract, right, in this country, right, makes a payment for a contract to a third party in another country for a registered company, and then subsequently to find out that that company is also owned by a Sri Lankan. I'm really shocked at it, that a thing like this should have happened.
Nimal Pereira has emerged as a bagman for the ruling Rajapaksa family. In 2016, it was Pereira's confession which prompted the spectacular arrest of the Prime Minister's son, Nimal Rajapaksa. Pereira had admitted to collecting millions of rupees on Rajapaksa's behalf from a real estate company.
In your opinion, would you describe Nimal Pereira as a collector?
Of course. On behalf of the Rajapaksa's family, he was the famous collector of their family.
Oh, and there's Aspen Medical.
Aspen Medical.
It was anti-corruption campaigner Wasantha Samarasinga who tipped off the police.
Australia and New Zealand banking group. That is the account used by the Aspen Medical to send the money to the Singapore supervision accounts.
Triggering the years-long probe by Sri Lanka's FCID, or Financial Crimes Investigation Division, into suspected money laundering offences.
He wanted to protect the Rajapaksa's connections, and firstly he tried to hide all these connections. Finally, CID found so many details, that's why he couldn't continue that lie.
The police could find no evidence that Sabre Vision Holdings or Nimal Pereira had performed any service for the money paid by Aspen Medical. Those funds never went to the hospital.
The money trail led here to this property in an affluent suburb of Colombo. Nimal Pereira purchased it with some of the money from Sabre Vision Holdings. But what really caught the attention of police was that it was soon combined with the property immediately next door. It housed the private offices of Nimal Rajapaksa, the then president's son.
The question was obvious. Was Nimal Pereira again secretly collecting money for the Rajapaksa family, this time from the hospital contractors? And if so, what was the role of Aspen Medical?
Hello.
Nimal Pereira agreed to an interview at his house.
Hello, how are you? Linton Bessett from ABC Australia. Tell me about your career. I want to know what sectors of the economy that you have worked. You specialise in capital markets and securities,
Yeah, that's
but
right.
never in the health sector. You don't work in the health sector.
No, never in the health sector, but I was into leisure, then manufacturing, and finance, and capital markets.
But you've never been a supplier of medical equipment? Or...
Never in my career.
Mr. Pereira told us he was an agent for the head hospital contractor, but never did anything for Aspen Medical.
So why did Aspen Medical pay you 2 payments of 687,000 euros?
To me?
To you?
No, Aspen has not paid to me.
Nothing at all?
No.
It sent the money into the accounts of your British Virgin Islands company?
No, it's wrong.
Sabre Vision Holdings?
Yeah, that is my previous employer.
At the time of those transactions, according to business documents from the British Virgin Islands, there was only one beneficiary of Sabre Vision Holdings, and that was Mr. Nimal Pereira.
No, that is because of by default. Since I became the managing director of that company, I became the beneficial owner.
Mr. Pereira's explanation to Four Corners differed wildly from what he originally told the police.
When you were questioned about that property purchase and where the money came from, you told the police that it came from an Italian businessman.
Yes.
That was wrong, wasn't it?
No, it is not wrong. It's correct.
And you told the police that Sabre Vision Holdings was associated with this Italian businessman.
No, I don't know. I can't remember.
But That was a lie, wasn't it?
No, I can't remember.
Why did you try to hide the payments?
So why do you want to know all these things?
Well, try my question. Why did you want to try and hide the payments?
What payments?
The payments that Aspen Medical put into Sabre Vision Holdings.
No, I don't want to answer, so you can go.
Well, we're just trying to understand why it would be that Aspen Medical would pay you that kind of money.
Riddled by corruption, Sri Lanka is now on the precipice of economic collapse. After returning to power, the Rajapaksa regime has shelved the Aspen Medical case and sacked its investigators. The former State Minister of Finance still wants answers.
I thought even in Australia there will be checks and balances, right, of how the Australian private sector works, whom they are paying and what they are paying for. And also, they need to be investigated also then for money laundering, including the Australian company.
Aspen Medical told Four Corners it had not received any requests from any government agency or court of law anywhere in the world for information on Nimal Pereira or Sabre Vision Holdings, but we would be happy to support them if such an inquiry was made. It said, we have a strong set of values that would preclude us working with organisations involved in corrupt practices. Aspen also said it was driven by a social purpose and maintained a commitment to the highest standards of service delivery.
I think the government needs to ask itself whether it is there to try and fill the pockets of a donor and a company that doesn't have a great track record, or whether it's there to ensure that people who need help get it. There's no question that there is an industry around trying to exploit as much money as you can, often at the expense of the misery and suffering of others.
Where's the accountability? Who holds the federal government accountable for these failings? Who? My sense is Aspen just keeps getting rewarded for bad performance. Not just bad performance, bad performance with dire consequences. So unacceptable, unacceptable. But who's holding them accountable?
I think that Aspen forgot that they were treating people.
What were they thinking about instead?
Profits. They were thinking about profits.